My name is Mohammad Shoaib, and we will start today's proceedings with the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Qul huwallahu ahad, Allahus samad, lam yalid wa lam yulad, wa lam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad. Sadaqallahul azim. Thank you very much for being with us today. We have a wonderful set of speakers here, and a diversified group of speakers, and it's a very interesting topic: navigating global shifts, implications for Pakistan. Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, CFA Society Pakistan has a mission to promote the highest standards of ethics and professional excellence in Pakistan. In line with this mission, the society provides many professional learning opportunities to its members and the finance professionals. Hence, in the last 1 year, many training sessions, workshops and panel discussions have been organized by the society. And I was just talking to Samir, and inshallah, we are going to collaborate with LUMS also to offer more opportunities in Lahore very soon. Ladies and gentlemen, the only constant in today's world is change. And we all understand that given the situation Pakistan is going through economically in the last couple of decades, we have to navigate our way to compete and perform to steer our economy out of one crisis and the other, and we are going through. You would recall that last year, June 2023, Pakistan was almost on the verge of our economic default, of external payment default, and our FX reserves were at a very low level. The standby agreement with the IMF provided a breathing space for 9 months, and we got some relief, and we are building on the reserves since then. And building on that successful completion of SBA program, IMF and Pakistan have reached a staff level agreement on a 37-month extended fund financing facility about $7 billion. And it is expected that in the next 1 month or so, or maybe by end of this month, IMF board will also approve it, the facility. However, this is not our first program, and I don't know whether it would be our last program. So the question is, will this program solve all of our economic problems? And the second question is, will we need another program? Obviously, the answer to the first question is a very clear no. It will not solve all our problems. It will just give us a breathing space to make the structural reforms and the changes which are so much needed to steer the economy out of one crisis and the other. The answer to the second question is a maybe. It really depends on what steps do we take in the next 3 years to actually make ourselves self-sufficient and reduce our borrowings from the external world. So today's our session will focus on the input from eminent speakers and panelists on several topics, and we will talk about 4 key areas. One of them is demographics, understanding how population shifts impact economic growth and social stability. And we have Dr. Salman with us, who will steer us through this topic in terms of how globally population and demographics are changing and what is there going to be their impact. Artificial intelligence, potential of AI to revolutionize industries, labor markets and the governance. And the third area is certainly geopolitics and economics, how shifts in the global power structures and alliances affect international relations and trade. And lastly but not least, the climate change, examining the environmental changes and their implications for economic development, resource management and social resilience. So we had one session in Karachi a few days ago, and that was followed by another round table with eminent bankers and industrials in Karachi, and today we are having third session. And I'm hoping that as a conclusion of these 3 events, we are able to come up with some clear guidelines and some ideas which can actually help the economy to get out of the mess we are in at this point in time. I will now introduce the speakers and the panelists, and then I will invite them one by one, and then first of all, then I will ask Dr. Salman Ahmed to deliver his keynote speech after that, and then there will be a panel discussion after that. So let's start with Dr. Salman Ahmed. He has been very kind to give us his personal time to us in his visit from UK. Dr. Salman is the global head of macro and asset allocation at Fidelity International, managing $5 trillion in assets. With a PhD from Cambridge and a background of Goldman Sachs, he has deep expertise in global and emerging market macroeconomics. He is a frequent expert heard on CNBC, BBC and Bloomberg, known for the strategic insights on economic trends. His leadership at Fidelity enhances the firm's global success. Recognized as a top expert in emerging market macroeconomics, Dr. Ahmed's insights influence investors, policymakers, and corporate leaders worldwide. Please give us a big round of applause. Please join us. Next, we have a very prominent speaker, Mr. Zafar Masud. And if I look at his bio and start reading it, it will take me 15 minutes to complete it. So I have to be, because everybody of you knows, but I will just briefly introduce him. He's a seasoned banker, entrepreneur, and public sector expert with career spanning 30 years, marked by significant achievements in banking, development, finance, energy, and corporate governance. He currently serves as the president and CEO of the Bank of Punjab and also chairs the board of directors at OGDC. He is also the chairman of the Pakistan Banks Association. And I must thank you that the session in Karachi was also hosted by PBA, the roundtable here. There's a long introduction. He has played many other roles in the past. I will probably skip it in the interest of time. And the last one is on our panel is Dr. Ali Hasanain, Associate Professor of Economics at LUMS. Dr. Ali Hasanain is an Associate Professor at the Lahore University of Management Sciences. He served as the Head of Department from 2019 to 2022. Dr. Hasanain's research focuses primarily on how public service delivery can be improved through reforms, initiatives, particularly through technological progress. And Dr. Hasanain's research has been featured in The Guardian, Economist, Huffington Post, and many other global publications. He has formerly served as the Global Leader Fellow at Oxford and Princeton Universities. Dr. Hasanain received his PhD from George Mason University in 2010. Thank you very much to everyone for being here today. And I would invite now Dr. Salman Ahmed to deliver his keynote speech. Then we will have a panel discussion. Thank you.
Be here, and thank you once again for inviting me. So what I'm going to do is in the next few minutes is share with you some long-term themes which are in play globally, but also interplay with the region, and then I think have important implications, at least to my mind, for Pakistan. And I'll try to make that case in front of you today. So I am, as I mentioned, I'm going to focus on long-term themes. I know it's fashionable in Pakistan to think about the long term. So bear with me when I talk about, decades worth of projections, because that's what is becoming more and more critical as global regimes start to change. So let's start with demographics. Shoaib Sahab talked about change and how it is a constant. John F. Kennedy used to say that change is the law of life. My own spin on it is that change actually is a matter of existence, life and death for Pakistan. If we don't change, there are going to be some serious consequences. So let's start with demographics. Demographics, according to some, is destiny. And what I want to share with you and put it on paper is that to at least highlight to you that the next 70 years, although maybe outside the horizon of many of us, including myself, but certainly in the horizon of our future generations, look completely different from what we have experienced over the last 70 years. So let's start with 2022, where, or the calibration point where we almost are. This is based on UN central models. You can see China, India, they're up there. Pakistan with around 240 million population. But have a look at what's happening in 2040. So there's a major shift starting to happen. So China going through a contraction in population. India still growing, and then Pakistan obviously growing quite at a rapid pace. And by the end of the century, you're looking at around $500 billion, or doubling of the population, based on these, almost doubling of the population based on these projections. But this is only part of the story. A lot of these countries will vanish from the top 10, not because they are falling behind on a relative basis, but they are starting to contract. And Russia is one interesting example of that, which is already contracting in terms of its population. Japan is another one. The second dimension of this demographic angle is working age populations, and that also links with aging. So working age populations in developed markets, more or less, in the next couple of decades, and obviously then beyond that, are going to see, according to these projections, around 10 percentage point reduction. So let's take the example of US. You are starting at around 60% of working age population. By the end of the century, you are at 50%. China has much more severe reduction in working age populations. And Pakistan, India, firstly have increases, and then they start to decrease by the end of the century. Why am I talking about the end of the century and these dynamics? Because if you overlay another angle on this, which is basically changing in population numbers, growth in certain countries, reduction in certain countries, especially the more developed ones, and then you interplay that with aging population. So average age in Pakistan is early 20s, in the UK it's touching 40, and that's thanks to the immigrants. If you only talk about the white population, the average age is mid 40s. Similar trends in Germany, other continental European countries, and obviously US is a bit different. US has relied heavily on immigration over the years to plug that demographic trend. But with the rise of anti-immigration sentiment, obviously UK was a very recent example, that actually clashes with what I'm sharing with you, which is that these countries are also the ones who are going to see contractions. And if they don't allow immigration, unless until the fertility rates change dramatically, they are going to see contraction of population and aging population. That also begs the question of geopolitics and geoeconomics. One angle we have been focused on is Russia. As you can see, in 2022, it's already 145 million and reducing. Russia's population contraction is not happening uniformly. It's actually the east, or Siberia, which is contracting much faster than the west, where obviously the main cities are. And Siberia also, as we will talk about climate change, which is my second topic, which I'll touch on very quickly, is also a major beneficiary of climate change. So climate change is a very geographical phenomenon. The winners and losers of climate change are not the same. Obviously Pakistan, India, Bangladesh and Latin American countries are massive losers of climate change, but they are big winners of climate change as well, and Siberia is one of them. So it also begs the question, who will go for those resources? If you don't have a population there, then who are the major population centers who can lay claim to these resources? And that's why long-term history is important. A lot of our economics is calibrated on post-World War thinking paradigms, mostly Western thinking paradigms, and I'm the first one to acknowledge that I've been trained in Western frameworks. Western frameworks are very much shaped by post-World War II state of affairs. The state of affairs pre-World War IIs or the World Wars were very different. State of affairs in pre-World War were shaped by population, were shaped by resource need and resource coupled with technology. So one thing I would like to say is that if Pakistan and India were in the 1860s with the kind of military power they have, we would be colonizing other countries. It's the rule of the games have changed after the World War II, and then the multilateral agencies and the Bretton Woods system, all that stuff started really after World War II. But things are changing. These demographic profiles are not the same. You have a massive difference between the developed market world, which is aging, and you have very young populations who are growing quite fast, in countries, especially like India, Pakistan, Nigeria, and some African countries you can see on the list. Another one I do want to highlight is China. China is aging. The average age of China is the same as US, almost touching 40, but it is contracting, which is going to be a very powerful theme in the next few decades in terms of how China manages that. They do focus on it, unlike us. They do talk about 10 years, 15 year, 20 year planning, and the demographic profiles are a very major important topic for them. Second theme I want to share with you is long-term theme again, is climate change. This is a map of climate damage function. What basically it says, what it does is that it through a modeling approach, GDP losses as a result of climate change are being mapped geographically. So red, as you can imagine, is extreme damages. Blue are the beneficiaries. As I mentioned to you, Russia, most of it is a major beneficiary of climate change. So is Canada, and so is Northern America as well. It's really South America, i.e. southern part of USA, which is more exposed to climate change. So one point I want to highlight is that climate change is not a lose-lose game. Firstly, they are massive beneficiaries of climate change as well. Globally, based on this damage function, which is basically assumes that nothing is done to confront emissions and temperature rises by at least 3 degrees by the end of the century, you're talking about 25% damage to GDP versus baselines. But these are not uniform numbers. So around 50% damage, around about 50% damage to China, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan are seen as wiped out by the end of the century on these damage functions. Now, these damage functions, as you can imagine, is a forecasting exercise. You can say, oh, these are, based on assumptions. There's a modeling behind it. Like any modeling, it has its weaknesses, it has its strengths. But what we can calibrate is that how is the model working versus reality. So me and my team started working on it 2017 onwards. We have published 5 papers on this topic since 2020, as we have incorporated these scenarios into our investment frameworks. And what we have found is that in the last 5 years, the physical damage of climate change has been higher than what you are seeing in these numbers. So at the global level, you'll see that the damage, which is the black line, starts to go south after 2040. So basically, say projection is that you don't see much damage till 2040, and all of a sudden after 2040, the damage or tipping points come into play. The world loses arable land. That's the major assumption behind these models, and there is a damage to the capital base of countries. But the reality is that the physical damage has been earlier, and Pakistan, I'm sure, is witnessing that on a year-to-year basis. The climate has changed. You have got more rains, heat waves. In the UK, flooding risks have gone up. Ocean temperatures are making records year after year. According to these models, it was supposed to happen after 2040. But this is happening much earlier. What the model did get wrong, so basically the model got it wrong by being optimistic, firstly. The second thing the model gets wrong is that transition risk, which is the policy changes, the regulation, have not been as severe or as impactful as we had assumed in our scenarios. So, combining these two forces, there are obviously a lot of important dimensions which come into play as we are standing right now. So I know we have to think about economic stability right now. Shoaib Sahab talked about IMF programs. I think with Argentina, we are the most frequent customer of IMF. But the critical question is one of existence here. Maybe not in our horizon of 10-20 years, but certainly in the horizon of our future generations. And second question is demographics, as I mentioned, and how it will interplay with this climate change force which is in place right now. When we are doing scenario analysis for European, for example, investors, we do not talk about physical damage for them. You can see from these maps, Europe is mostly on the blue lines. What we talk to them about and try to model is migration flows. So if there is a major climate change event in Africa or South Asia, and that triggers massive immigration flows towards Europe. And by the way, that has happened in history. And then you mix it up with the state of human technology, the military technologies, you mix it up with AI, you have a mix of a number of factors which are very much in play. So the main message I want to give you is that if we are going to look back to the last 10, 20, 25 years to make any opinions of the future, I think we are going to be horribly wrong. We have to start thinking about a different world which rhymes with the past, potentially the pre-World War I and II past, which is much more volatile, more divisive. You can see that with the wars. And these immigration forces, which are obviously interplaying with demographics, are even going to become more caustic or powerful. Why? Because whatever the populations in developed markets think about as indigenous is reacting to these forces now. And that's becoming very visible with elections and the rise of the far right parties in a number of these countries. So as we think about the future, I think these are important forces to take into account. There is obviously a dividend effect here of population, but this is also a liability effect if this is not managed. Now I'm going to spend a few minutes before we start the panel on US elections. This is going to be very important elections, already turning out to be an extraordinary election in terms of no precedent in history of a candidate stepping down, a candidate who is the president stepping down in the middle of the race. You have a felon or convicted felon who's obviously also one of the candidates, and you have obviously two presidents initially running against each other, and then you have a new candidate now which has been introduced into the mix. So what are the polls saying? Polls are volatile, but right now, as things stand, we have seen Harris polls rise quite sharply since Biden stepped down. This is the yellow line. You've also seen the prediction markets move against Trump. They peaked after his assassination attempt, now roughly around 50%. Harris odds are also rising. I think the latest number is that yellow line is slightly above blue now. This was a week ago. So you've seen a major shift once again where the Democrats are making lost ground as Biden has stepped down. But let's not forget that US elections and electoral systems is a very weird one, if I can use that term, because it is not a pure first past the post system. It is also not a proportional representation system. Last election was decided by 45,000 votes in these swing states, or what are called battleground states. The election before was decided by 150,000 votes. And that's a function of how the US population organizes itself. So you have states which are blue states like New York or California. No matter the candidate, those states will always vote blue, given how the population has decided to organize itself. And then obviously you have some very powerful entrenched red states. So these 6 states is where it comes down to, and within these 6 states, some key districts it basically boils down to, and that's why a lot of people focus on these polls rather than the nationwide polls, because they add little value when you're trying to predict the outcomes. So what has happened is that Harris has picked up pace in some of these battleground states. In Michigan, which has a heavy Muslim population, by the way, Arab population, she is now leading versus Trump. So we will continue to watch these going into the elections. They are obviously very volatile. The speeches are going to be important. But ultimately, these are the states which will decide the US elections. Now, I want to focus a bit more on what their policy frameworks are, what are the similarities, what are the differences. Now, a lot of people think that there's a huge amount of difference between Democrats and Republicans. Actually, on many areas, they don't differ too much. Their worldview or foreign view has become very similar. It's really on the domestic side and the social side that you have got major differences. So they both are towards industrial policy, which is Buy American and domestic subsidies. And I love to ask people from World Bank, IMF to explain to me how they will justify this to emerging markets when US is becoming protectionist. This is a reality. This is not a theoretical exercise. Both of them are focused on industrial policy, which has national security and national interest at the core of their policy agendas. China, both are against China and see China as an adversary, but their implementation method is different. So one talks about tariffs, the other talk about managed decoupling. Big tech, I think no matter who wins, we think there will be restrictions on big tech, some shape or form. UK is already putting a very stringent online safety bill after the riots. So freedom of speech is going to be, reconfigured in a world where you have very divisive populations. Defense, major area of focus, and Middle East, very similar views when it comes to Israel and Iran. What they differ on business regulation. So one wants regulation, which is Democrats, whilst Trump is anti-regulation. Trump doesn't want to do anything with climate. He thinks that's a joke. In fact, the joke in the US is that ESG means energy security guns rather than, the other side of the terms. Taxes, so Trump wants to cut taxes, especially it's quite important because fiscal deficit in the US is very, very high. Immigration, as you may have heard already, deportation, amnesty, Muslim bans, and so on and so forth. And then Ukraine, Europe, they have very different views, whereby Trump wants to end the war in Ukraine versus Russia. Where they differ mostly, and that's what gets a lot of attention, is social issues. So, reproductive rights, firearms, and DNI. So, what kind of world we see going forward? I think if Trump wins with Congress, i.e. goes to Republicans, he's talking about a 60% tariff on China and then 10% universal tariffs on all imports from the rest of the world. 60% tariffs on China, 10% rest of the world. He wants to extend the tax cut and other things, and industrial policy dynamics. He wants to stop green tech and go back to fossil fuels. But let me show you the average tariff rates US has put in place. So the tariff on China from US is around 10.5%. He's talking about bringing it to 60. Although you can argue there's a lot of rhetoric, which I agree with, but even half of that goes through. You're talking about a tariff rate which goes from 10.5 to 30%. Rest of the world is 1.1%, goes to 10 under his policies. According to our estimates, that will raise up to $500 billion of revenues for the US and increase US inflation by around 300 basis points, 3 percentage points, and damage US growth by 1 percentage points. But it's a major damage for China if that goes through. Of course, there are then details around that. I won't bore you with it, but there is exemption angles, what we are looking at, existing trade agreements, rerouting and retaliatory tariffs, Why am I sharing this with you is that China-US decoupling is real. I don't know the answer, but Pakistan needs to have a view on how they're going to play it. Because if these tariffs are put in place, China will be reduced for space. China is not as strong internationally as it was in 2013. Just a little bit, I'll end here, just mindful of time as well. We have already seen restructuring of supply chains start to take place. Resilience and national security are the most important dimensions now. This is what I get from our conversations with multiple corporates across the globe. And their frustration, if I can be candid here, with the academic class, with the multilaterals or the consultants, if you will, is that they have been trained to think about profit maximization, efficiency gains. They are not trained to tell them about how to create resilience in the system, how to manage geopolitical risk, how to, create redundancy in their supply chains. And that's where intra-country and inter-country relationships start to become very important. So it's not only a pure commercial story that you can provide the cheapest, product in the market. The question is, where is your plant? Especially if you're doing it in key commodities and key supply chain areas, and you're seeing that change. For example, China's percentage of total China exports to US pre-trade war 1 was 20.4%. It has now dropped to 13.4%, and most of that has been picked up by ASEAN and to a certain extent Europe. So things are already shifting, and if Trump wins, this will accelerate quite significantly. And that has obviously importance when we are talking about an export policy, because nobody exports to planet Mars. You are exporting to countries who are undergoing these major shifts. So with that, let me pause and hand over to Shoaib Sahab for our panel to start. But thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Salman, for a very interesting, insightful presentation. And we have a lot to cover in today's session. So let's start about demographics. That was the first topic you brought into the discussion. So Pakistan has a big population, 240 million people, and as you mentioned that in the by end of the decade, we are going to be close to 480 million. Our population will double in the next 70-75 years. And it's a young population. 54% of the population at the moment is under 25 years of age. Even if you look at the next 15-20 years, still 50% of the population will be under 25. So Zafar, coming to you, certainly it can be a demographic dividend or it can be a liability. And in terms of our spending on education, we are spending less than 2% of our GDP on education. A lot of students, a lot of children are out of school. So how do we develop the capacity and the infrastructure? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Thank you very much, Shoaib. Thank you, Dr. Salman. Extremely enlightening and very thought-provoking presentation. थोड़ा सा डरा दिया है आपने, बट एंड ऑफ द सेंचुरी तक लेके गए हैं, तो मैं तो खैर मेरे तो बच्चे नहीं हैं, तो अल्लाह का शुक्र है कि जिनके बच्चे हैं उनको बहुत परेशान होना चाहिए इस बात पे. So it is a scary situation, and thank you for shaking us up on these issues, Dr. Saab. These are very genuine problems, but I think somehow we tend to ignore them and look the other way, thinking that a miracle would happen and things will change. It won't change. We have to take them head on and get them sorted out. To my mind, Shoaib, we're going through the first economic world war. I've said it many times in my various talks and articles. This is the first economic world war. And जिस तरह डॉक्टर साहब फरमा रहे थे कि after the two world wars, the entire there has been a shift in how the business was done before and after that. Just to share with you, in Western Europe, the spending towards the social sector was merely 10% of the total GDP then, and out of that, the education was merely 0.5%. So pension, health, education, all put together was 10%. Major investment at that time were diverted towards the defense side. Post World War, and that's 40 years down, and I'm talking about this number 2019, 10, 20, and then 40, 50 years later, after the World War, that number changed to 40%, because the realities change on the ground. People realize that spending on defense anymore is something which is not as beneficial in protecting their boundaries than investing in people. And out of that 40%, the education piece went as high as 10%. So there is a stated, tried and tested formula, and I draw the analogy of those world wars with this first economic world war. The shift tend to happen. We have to invest in our people. We've been talking about it as well, but there has been not much action. There is a lot of criticism that perhaps the funding that we have committed on the education side is not adequate. I don't think that's merely the case. Although India is around 40%, 4% of the GDP, we are at 2%. Perhaps we need to at least get to 2%. But when you put the subas together, the percentage is much higher. It's the wastage, it's the quality which is more important than anything else. It's the development of skills which is key. And then on top of that, while the rest of the world will be looking towards opening up the immigration, it seems like that Pakistan seems to be losing out on that front too. And our dearest partners in Middle East also have kind of closed the doors on us. It's a very, very scary development. We need to focus on the basic education where the basic skills could be provided. Skills is the name of the game. In my very humble opinion, this is what we need to focus on.
Thank you, Zafar. Dr. Ali Hasanain, coming to you, as we know that there are 26 million people, children out of school in the country. Now, even if we have the funding available, and as Zafar mentioned, it's just basically the wastage of that. Even if we correct this problem, do we have the infrastructure? Do we have the faculty? Do we have the schools, the network to actually accommodate these 26 million people?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. First of all, let me echo Zafar Bhai. Excellent presentation and wonderful event to be at. I think infrastructure and the amount of capacity we have is endogenous. That can change. We've got enough educated people in this country to educate the rest. The question is, how do we create an architecture that allows that to happen? And while there's a lot of wastage, we have to first then open up the question of why that wastage happens. And in terms of, so first let me step back and just put before you that the forecast is that by 2047, Pakistan's pre-metric education outcomes will be at the level that India and Bangladesh reached around 2011, 2014. So it will take us that long just to catch up to where they were more than a decade ago. And that's how we were about 35 years behind them in education. So then the question becomes, well, what's going wrong? And there are problems both at the public level and the private level. At the private level, I think we're not qualitatively different from our peer countries. At the public level, there is good research that shows that the quality of the public education infrastructure impacts what in turn the private sector is able to do. because the public sector can go in, especially in areas where there's a lack of education, get the first few people trained in a village, and then let the private sector form schools that will then get that education. But the private sector is not very good at that first push. I would say that the amount of allocation that we are making to education is absolutely a problem, and we all know why we're not allocating more money. There are multiple causes, but one clearly is our allocations are extraordinarily high to defense, and even in terms of our 30-year time horizon for defense, this is an untenable situation to be in. Pakistan was about a sixth the size of India in terms of our economy size in 91. We're about an 11th the size today, and if global projections are to be believed, we will be about a 30th the size of India by around 2050. And so that means, compared to 1991, it will be as if our relative power will be as much weaker than that Pakistan as it was to India back then. Right? That's the scale of the decline. And then the worry becomes that we are not responding to this, to any of the problems that we have, whether it's the savings rate or the education rate or the amount of pollution we have. We'll come to climate change. We have a broken decision architecture in this country, and so I don't think that, coming back to education, I don't think infrastructure or the amount of personnel we have is a problem. I think we are under allocating money to it, and part of it is that we have to crowd in investments through public sector investments. This year we put more money into paying for PIA losses than we put into the Higher Education Commission, or about roughly equal amounts. We put 20% of the HEC budget into buying laptops for people, and this is an intervention that has no basically evidence base. Again, how does that decision-making architecture decide to put 20% into laptops? It's not being supported by evidence, and so I think we can get one thing, and we'll come to AI in a bit, but one opportunity in the next 20-30 years is that AI is likely to make educating people up till at least college level much easier to do, because we'll have these chatbots, sophisticated chatbots that are able to speak local languages, that are able to look at what a student is saying in terms of the quality of their responses to questions and tailor the next training to that. But like with the promise of the smartphone, about 10 years ago there was a lot of promise of smartphones will revolutionize education. It requires us to roll up the sleeves and get work done on the ground.
Thank you very much. And I was going to come to Dr. Salman now, and looking at his international exposure and experience, continuing with what Dr. Ali Hasanain mentioned, how can we use technology and AI actually to cover up our deficit in terms of educational resources and our ability to provide education to children?
I think this, Professor touched on it, but I see AI as being a major source of quantum leap for countries like Pakistan. In fact, they may become a liability for developed countries, and I can touch on that. We've been working on a lot on that one, how that can be troublesome development for them. But for countries like Pakistan, why? Because you don't have to do anything; you just have to embrace it. Somebody has done the work. All you have to do is connect with it. It basically brings the marginal cost of delivery of education quite low. All you have to do is discipline. Content can be delivered. All you need is a disciplining force to make sure that content is being engaged with and outcomes are measured. So it's like, the analogy I use is like, so Pakistan missed using a telecom analogy. So Pakistan missed the analog range. You missed the GSM, you missed 2G, 3G, 4G. Now you can just buy 6G because it's available at a very cheap cost. Now AI is also a geopolitically sensitive technology. It's actually a very different technology to internet. Internet was a connecting technology. This is a replacement technology. Now, for aging populations, one angle is that AI can start replacing immigration. So you don't need call centers in India. In fact, India is very exposed to jobs being insourced back. So low tech, or I'm saying low tech now, but 10 years ago they were high tech. Jobs which are directly competing with this AI infrastructure. And then you have AI in China, which potentially is as good as US. It's trained on much wider set of data. And that's something is important to consider. As we go forward, I believe that you will have restrictions on usage of AI in an attempt to monetize it. So we need to think about how we keep that technology free. So there's this free zone right now, which we can take advantage of. As it becomes widely used, the developed countries will have to make a decision on, they are getting data from you versus giving a technology, because now they can see anything, right? I mean, that's how the data works, and that's a very sensitive topic in terms of where does the data sit, who has access to, and so forth, both in China and both in US, which is probably the underlying war. Zafar Sahab was talking about the economic war, world war is going to be on data, basically. And you build it up, it's on tech, and so on and so forth. So there is this window of opportunity which I think we should be thinking about to really reduce the cost of production. So India spending 4% on the old model, you're spending low anyways. Why not just spend it on a cheaper thing to drive a major shift up? So I think technological development has always bailed out humankind. Otherwise your population cannot be at 8 billion, right? I mean, if you look at the long-term maps of population, they were stuck at 100 million for millennia. Then they started going up, and now we have gone into exponential rise because of technology, right? Because how are we producing food for 8 billion people? That's a huge topic in food security for these countries who care about it, and Pakistan should be caring about it, because Pakistan is a major population center. Because when we do war games or scenario analysis, what we need to think about is that these are not slower moving things. They can happen suddenly, and then they can create ripple effects. You saw Bangladesh, all of a sudden you had massive pushback against the government. What kind of scenario Pakistan, which is always on the brink of economic disaster, you couple it with food shortage, what happens, right? This is how you have to then force action through. But the positive side is that you have technologies available literally now for free, which can help you make that leap. I wouldn't want to be in this situation with 25 years ago, when you didn't have these kind of technologies available. So education is one. The other one I would mention is your skill-based education that Masud was talking about. We have to start thinking about, is undergrad do we have to train thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in undergrad now? Is that the mark of education? Why not skill-based education? Why not, as Zafar was talking about, creating human capital quality rather than traditional university models which have not changed for hundreds of years. The technology is different. Now people are using AI ChatGPT to produce an assignment. The teacher is using ChatGPT to create an assignment. Is this going to be an AI versus AI game now? So we have to start thinking about skill-based and bang for buck impact. And because I believe I'll end with that topic, a lot of our education, and it's inspired by Western education standards really, is designed to create academics. We are not here an academic production factory. What we need is a skill-based economy and skill-based labor force, which can use the current technology effectively at a cheaper cost and do it reliably, right? So that's your strength. That's your strength to create that asset.
Thank you. Yeah, Zafar, you want to add something?
If I may, Dr. साहब ने बहुत interesting dimension दिया है to the thing. मैं इत्तेफाक से अभी lately बांग्लादेश तो हम सभी देख ही रहे हैं बड़ा closely, but I for some other conference, I was looking at Sri Lanka very closely too. And the similarities that I kind of saw there was the fact that both of them are very well educated, but perhaps on the skill side, they were not as well trained. So the frustration was much higher. In case of Pakistan, जो हमारा level of education is 58% हम claim करते हैं, वो भी doubt है. Industry countries तो 90% से ऊपर है. We are perhaps not seeing this kind of a backlash, because people are just not, they are not aware of the seriousness of the issues and the matters, and perhaps the skill piece is saving the day for them. So that's very important aspect. The other one that you talked about on the education spending पे, तो ये मैं आपको बता दूं कि we are not the only one. इस वक्त situation ये है कि on the social, and this has to change and shift. और वो बिल्कुल different discussion है. We'll talk about it a bit later अगर time हुआ तो, या अगर आपने सवाल पूछा तो. इस वक्त 50% के करीब population, 3.3 billion लोग जिन मुल्कों में रह रहे हैं, वहाँ पर spending on social sector is less than the debt servicing. Now this is not a sustainable model. अगर वो World War I और World War II से पहले वो डिफेंस पे बहुत ज़्यादा स्पेंड हो रहा था, तो अब वो डेट सर्विसिंग पे हो रहा है. एंड दैट शिफ्ट इन द डेट सर्विसिंग इज वेरी नेसेसरी टू प्रिवेंट द लीवे वेदर वी वांट टू स्पेंड दैट ऑन एजुकेशन पर से डायरेक्टली. बिल्कुल सही डॉक्टर साहब ने फरमाया, बहुत अच्छी डायमेंशन दी कि हमारा फोकस कम्प्लीटली एकेडमिक्स क्रिएट करने पे है, जबकि स्किल इज द की. एंड क्या हमने वहाँ पर स्पेंड करना है? दैट्स व्हाई जो स्पेंडिंग वी नीड टू स्पेंड स्मार्टली नाउ. Constraint will be there, is always there. We are not the only country who is facing this constraint, but the others are spending it much smartly than us.
Thank you, Zafar. So moving on to the geopolitics, and we are seeing what's happening globally: Ukraine-Russia war, Israel-Palestinian conflict, Iran-Israel, Taiwan-US-China relationships, Pakistan-India relationship. You just talked about Bangladesh. What we have seen in Bangladesh recently. So I would like to pick your brain on, do we see any opportunities for Pakistan in this global fiasco? And then we will go to Dr. Salman to add on to it.
Well, you see, overall, Dr. Salman also talked about it earlier. Overall, there has been a shift because of China-America conflict of trade. And, Vietnam seems to be the biggest beneficiary of it. Their GDP got the benefit of 7.9%. Just because of the shift of demand for electrical appliances from China to Vietnam. We've seen the benefit of that going to Malaysia, South Korea, Mexico for automobiles, South Korea and Malaysia on semiconductor and electronics. So you see,
sorry to interrupt here, but given that what you mentioned, so many countries have benefited out of this conflict between China and US, and Pakistan is one of the biggest allies of China. So where do we stand?
Yeah, no, that's a very good dimension. But to be honest with you, it's one of the biggest challenge that we have had with China was the lopsided free trade agreement. We import something like 19.8 billion rupees from them, and we export them around 1.9 billion. The equation needs to be changed. So while there is an opportunity that we can move towards cheaper imports from them, for frankly speaking, I don't see China adding too much value in our requirements of imports as such. On the export side, unfortunately, we are not as well prepared for the world. India has already taken the advantage on IT, pharmaceuticals, and textiles, by the way, with this diversion. I think the biggest opportunity for us is pretty similar to where India has capitalized on. I don't see China being, much of an help for us. But if we have good relationship with the West, then perhaps we have an opportunity. It's a conundrum that we are stuck in. Look, China is stuck with its own set of very serious problems and issues. On both diplomatic side, their own internal problems, and also on the economic side. 65 countries which are under debt stress. China has the single large exposure of over 10% external debt with them. 18 restructurings have been done in the last 3 years. 10 in 10 countries. Majority is China centric. Sri Lanka, by the way, again the crisis started from the China situation. We need to tread very carefully on this whole equation and make sure that our interests are protected. डॉक्टर साहब ने भी बात की अमेरिका की. अमेरिका ने तो हमेशा यही किया, कोई नई बात नहीं है. प्रोटेक्शनिस्ट अभी हो गए. बात आप करते हैं, वो बड़ी खूबसूरत बात है कि कैपिटलिज्म विदाउट फेलियर इज अ रिलीजन विदाउट सिन. तो वो तो उन्होंने बैंकों को तो बैठने ही नहीं दिया, ना एयरलाइंस को बैठने दिया, ना इंश्योरेंस कंपनीज को बैठने दिया. हर जगह तो जाके पैसे डाल देते हैं. हमारे लिए बिल्कुल सेट डिफरेंस है, बट ये हमारा कसूर है. वी नीड टू डिवाइज आवर ओन स्ट्रेटजी एंड फिगर आउट व्हाट इज सूटेबल फॉर अस एंड देन डिवाइज आवर foreign policy accordingly.
Thank you. Dr. Sahab?
No, I would add to Zafar Sahab. I think this is true in the sense like हम लोग वही क्योंकि the cost for emerging markets और frontier markets में आ गया पाकिस्तान, जो कि reliant है multilateral agencies के. वो ये है कि वो फिर एक ही framework, वही paradigm उनको मिलता है. अगर आप middle power से जाके मिले, जैसे मैं मिडल ईस्ट जाता हूँ, मैक्सिको चले जाएं आप, या एशिया में आप घूमे फिरें, आसियान कंट्रीज में, वो मल्टीलैटरल एजेंसीज के कंस्ट्रेंट में नहीं है. तो वो अपनी एक थिंकिंग और अपना एक इकोनॉमिक फ्रेमवर्क क्रिएट करते हैं विच इज सेंट्रिक टू देयर ओन कंट्रीज रियलिटीज. क्योंकि हमारे जो फ्रेमवर्क्स हैं वो ग्लोबल पॉवर्टी एलिवेशन हो रही है, जिस बंदे को वहाँ लगा देंगे वो सारी उम्र यही करता रहेगा. So you have to think about कि geo-economic situation change हो रही है. You're right, it's a conundrum, but have we thought about कि चाइना का क्या रोल है गोइंग फॉरवर्ड, उसके डेमोग्राफिक्स के साथ क्या हो रहा है, चाइना की डोमेस्टिक डिमांड को सर्विस कैसे करना है. चाइना हैज अ ह्यूज डोमेस्टिक डिमांड डेफिसिट, क्योंकि उनका जो चैलेंज ये है कि उन्होंने ओवर इन्वेस्ट किया हुआ है. हमारा उल्टा मिरर है चाइना, जो हमने नहीं किया ना, वो अब चाइना वांट्स टू बिकम लाइक पाकिस्तान. हम क्या करते हैं, कंजम्पशन. हम लोगों के इर्द गिर्द वॉर्स हुई, हमें पैसा आया, हमने कंजम्पशन कर ली. कोई हमने प्लांट्स लगाए, कोई मैन्युफैक्चरिंग नहीं लगाई प्रॉपर जिसमें हमें कंपैरेटिव एडवांटेज हो, कोई मैसिव ट्रेड डील ली हो वर्सेस जियोपॉलिटिक्स, राइट? नहीं, हमने कुछ नहीं किया, हमने कंजम्पशन की. अब चाइना वांट्स टू डू कंजम्पशन बिकॉज दे हैव ओवर इन्वेस्टेड इन कैपेसिटी. दे वांट टू बिल्ड रोड्स समवेयर एल्स, क्योंकि उनके पास इतनी कैपेसिटी है टू बिल्ड रोड. जस्ट एन एग्जांपल. सो मैन्युफैक्चरिंग इज अ ह्यूज ऑब्वियसली ओवर कैपेसिटी है, उनकी डिफ्लेशन आ रही है. सो क्वेश्चन फॉर अस इज कि भी हम उसके साथ कैसे कनेक्ट करें इन अ जियो इकोनॉमिक सेंस, जिसमें मिलिट्री भी आती है, उसमें इकोनॉमिक कनेक्टिविटी भी आती है. इट्स अ मल्टी डायमेंशनल कनेक्टिविटी rather than a mercantilist relationship कि ये रिटर्न ऑन कैपिटल आपको मिलेगा. Geopolitics में और geoeconomics में economics is important but not the only main driving force, and that is changing, right? So जब मैं engage करता हूँ Chinese officials से, policy makers से, obviously when they realize कि आप पाकिस्तान से हैं तो they थोड़ा सा एक वो कम हो जाता है barrier, but what the unified view I get is कि भाई firstly किससे बात करें, नंबर 2 किस होराइजन पे बात करें, क्योंकि वो होराइजन ही नहीं हमारे मैच हो रहे उनसे. क्योंकि आप हमारा इस वक्त होराइजन और क्या स्ट्रैटेजी है, 5 बिलियन दे दें, दैट्स द स्ट्रैटेजी. that is not a strategy, and I think the world obviously move कर रही है, and we have to start thinking about we take our assets and our strengths seriously, then we can engage and talk about it, right? So yes, Vietnam has picked up a lot, as Zafar was saying. ASEAN countries generally have picked it up, but Pakistan has a unique strength in terms of geopolitically, politically आप किधर हैं और आप corridor कहाँ हैं in a world which is, अब India जो है, from a Western perspective is seen as China plus strategy. India is not only getting capital just because they are the most efficient producer. India में तो manufacturing होती ही नहीं है, ये नहीं कभी उन्होंने services mostly किए हैं. But now we are seeing manufacturing going back because of China plus strategy, right? So we have to start thinking about कि भी हमने कैसे engage करना है, and किस horizon पे करना है और किस consistency करना है. उसके लिए domestic noise has to come down quite significantly.
Thank you. There are a lot of audience questions as well, and first question is Dr. Salman. You mentioned AI may be negative for the developed world. Can you explain that?
Sure. So AI का, as I mentioned, it's a replacement technology. So white collar jobs अगर वो replace करना शुरू करता है, I don't think it's happening right now, by the way. I think we are a few years away from it. अगर वो white collar jobs replace करना शुरू करते हैं, then current tax code can be white collar ही पैसे देता है taxes में. So taxation is mostly white collar focused. So आपके जो billionaires हैं वो tax ही देते हैं. I'm potentially paying more tax than Musk, right? क्योंकि वो उसको stock lending model use करते हैं, and it's all legal, by the way. So it's not like he's doing something illegal. So the most of your taxation is income generated. So capital is not taxed. So if AI starts replacing income generating jobs, you have a fiscal crunch, unless until you change your tax code. Now these countries have already got debt to GDP ratios, most of them above 100%. Germany is an exception, but most of them have above 100%, which is back to World War II levels. उनके लिए जो economic conundrum है कि उन्होंने debt ratios को कैसे नीचे आना है with the social welfare commitments and aging populations, जो कि commitments और rise करती जाएंगी. And that's why you're seeing a lot of tension in these countries, क्योंकि पैसे crunch हो रहे हैं. As long as लोगों के पास पैसे आप फेंकते रहें, they are happy, right? So that AI creates that fiscal problem for some of these countries. So capital will have to be retaxed differently. दूसरा ये है कि AI is not only a software game; it is also a hardware game. So data centers become very important. Water availability is important. So a lot of these data centers which are feeding AI are being moved away from California because California is a water deficient state. So we have to also start thinking about कि हमने embrace कर रहे हैं तो कल हमें switch off ना कर दें वो, क्योंकि वो कहेंगे हमारे पास data centers नहीं है आपको service करने के लिए. So you may have to build your own hardware to do that, right? Capacity constraints हैं. So AI is not only a software. This is backed by massive data and data processing. Now quantum computing अगर आ जाए, which is obviously in the pipes, I'm told कि a lot of these processing जो AI कर रही है, it can go into milliseconds, so you can even go faster than you can think of, and that is also going to play a big role. So water also crosses with AI. AI, as I said, is not like a software to produce, हो रहा है. इसके पीछे आप data what you're training them, so आप अपना data दे रहे हैं, वो कोई process होके आ रहा वापस. The software तो बिल्कुल last end पे आता है,
right?
Language model. So and then last but not the least, misinformation and disinformation. कि भी ethical जो timeline है वो लोगों के लिए फर्क है. So China is changing their AI to reflect their own values. West की अपनी values हैं, और West की values सब diverge भी होती हैं depending कि वो किससे deal कर रहे हैं. वो भी अब एक important topic है. So उसमें फिर ethical side of things में regulations can be quite, so that may slow down some of the penetration of some of these technologies.
Thank you. Zafar sir, coming to you, we talked about US elections, Democrats versus Republicans. So, and a scenario was shared by Dr. Salman as to about the difference in policy. So, how do you think Pakistan will be impacted by who comes to the White House?
एक तो डॉक्टर सलमान ने जो है ना बहुत एक पर्टिकुलर सेगमेंट के लिए पॉपुलर सेगमेंट है, उसमें पानी फेर दिया सारा एक है, क्योंकि वो ज़्यादा दोनों का इंटरेस्ट नहीं होगा. हम बड़ी होप्स लगा के बैठे हुए हैं पाएगा तो पता नहीं क्या हो जाएगा. I tend to agree with Dr. Salman. I don't think there will be any material shift towards Pakistan. The modus operandi of both, by the principles are perhaps the same, but the modus operandi of both the parties are very different. One is more economically driven and try and pull the strings economically. The other is more, at least, although it has changed in Biden's time a bit, we haven't seen that kind of aggression. It's been a proxy war pretty much. Then they coming in front and fighting, both in the case of Ukraine as well as in the Gaza conflict. In that situation, I think if I don't see much shift in Pakistan's situation. Frankly speaking, Pakistan no longer is not that important for them because of their own shift in policies. China is dealing with their own set of problems, so no longer Pakistan is something that they need to worry about. Yes, Pakistan perhaps they would like to keep them afloat, but beyond that, I don't think there will be any shift, whoever comes into power. We have some serious significant issues at hand. CPAC, we are the single largest beneficiary of BRI, and 40% of the BRI projects are all in trouble, one way or the other. 40 or 60% of that number. So there is a problem at hand that we need to deal with China, while on the US interest is kind of eroded, but we need to get them engaged in our affairs to some extent, because our dependence on IMF and other multilaterals will remain largely dependent, and because of that, I think it's important that we keep ourselves on the right side of US, whether we like it or not.
Thank you, Dr. Hasanain. I just want to move on to the next topic, which is climate change. And in terms of climate change, Dr. Salman presented a very scary picture that Pakistan may have a huge impact, that there's a 50% probability that the impact may be very high. So what do you think needs to be done? What are we lacking in this? Because we are not doing anything about it at the moment.
Right, so the reports that I've seen suggest that we are expecting something like somewhere between 1.3 and 2 degrees centigrade increase in average temperatures, and that this will cause an impact on agricultural yield of between 10 and 25%. So fall of our crop production of that amount, but that it will also be different across different crops. So there's heterogeneity there that is not well mapped out yet. The way to deal with this has to be, I think, two things, and one where I would differ with my co-panelists in an earlier assertion, which is that education needs to be more focused on vocational training. When you think of the university model, a lot of that has to be the creation of what is the nation's think tank, where scholarship happens on national problems. And there's no better sort of example of the use of a functional university system than this problem of climate change, where every country will have heterogeneous impacts to deal with, and therefore you need to have a large enough human capital base that is not just focused on immediate commercial problems, but is also engaged in thinking about the country on a 30-50 year time horizon, and that is the natural work of the university. So I suspect what they meant was probably that when we're training undergrads at that level, perhaps we get too academic, and there's something to be said for thinking about a model where early induction into certain careers is more vocational in its flavor. But the university must preserve space to work on grand problems that are more remote and so on. And so to figure out, no one can tell you very confidently what Pakistan's optimal response to climate change has to be. There's a lot of uncertainty there, and there's a dearth of a good evidence base. So I'll give you two other examples. One is air pollution. The estimates, again from universities, is that about Lahore is losing about 5 years of life expectancy because of air pollution. Pakistan on average is losing about 3 years of life expectancy. And it's been happening for the last 7 to 8 years, and we've done nothing about it. The other thing is that we're quickly reducing groundwater. So if you think of your housing societies and where does water come from, often you bore down and get water from the underground aquifers. Every year we know that we have to pump water a little bit deeper in. We share an aquifer with India. I think it goes beyond Punjab. So there's a shared pool of water underneath. We don't have good models of whether it is India over pumping water or whether we are over pumping water that's causing this, and the extent to which we have to create either national level or pan South Asia responses to this. So the first thing has to be understanding these problems better. The second is, and again, why aren't we doing this? These are problems that we know exist, and it comes back to this decision architecture that's broken. As I said earlier, I think Salman Saab said China is in some ways Pakistan's opposite in terms of consumption, which is very true. If you look at a map of Asia and you look at savings rates, the clear outlier in terms of high savings is China. It is so much an outlier that it's become a problem for them because they're not consuming enough. And the clear outlier in terms of low savings is Pakistan. It's become a problem for us because we're not investing enough. Right? Why don't we invest enough? Pakistani economists have been talking about the problem for 30 or 40 years, but because dealing with problems like, say, the savings rate or like climate change or like groundwater doesn't win votes or doesn't bring unelected officials into power, no one cares. That's the blunt truth.
Thank you. Okay, going back to
Shoaib, on the climate side, मेरे ख्याल से तो it's a lost opportunity for us. दुनिया में इस पर जो funding available है, Dr. Salman will bear me on this, और जो diversion हमारे पास आनी चाहिए थी, we have not been able to harness that. जो starting point है उसके अंदर, and thank God उसको थोड़ा काम शुरू हो गया, is the taxonomy. It's all over disjointed है. वो हमें एक जगह पे project को सबको डालना है, ताकि एक repository में वो आ जाए, and then we can tap funding against that. That whole piece, unfortunately, we are not working in tandem with each other. Sube are working in their own lines. In the federal government also, there are 3 agencies which are differently working on it. Well, in fact 4, and they all have to come together and work together to create some kind of taxonomy for it.
Definitely, I think I agree with Zafar Saab, and I think funding is available. Capital markets do want to help with the climate change issue, and they think they can create enough returns. So it's a blue bonds, debt for development swaps. There is innovation. Obviously, we started with green bonds as well. Impact investing is also shaping through into actual projects. But that needs governance, infrastructure, property rights, all the other basic problems which affect any investment will also affect anything which you're doing to mitigate or adapt to climate change. But you need, I think climate change can be interlinked with our debt burdens. So, debt for development swaps is an interesting concept by multilaterals. But the question again remains that, if you get that fiscal space, what are you going to do about it? Right? I mean, tomorrow your interest rate payments go to 0. What are you going to do about it? Are you going to do the same and get to the same point in 20 years? Because then you will not get the wipeout. But if you have a strategy and a plan that, I'm going to use this fiscal space for climate change mitigation, adaptation, and also tell the world that it is in their interest to invest in Pakistan and Bangladesh and India, because one of these countries collapses, we are 250 million or hundreds of million people are going to go. Right, so it's interconnected. Ultimately, it's a human problem. It's a planetary problem. It's not a national problem. In fact, I would argue that the nation states is a hindrance to this problem because it's a global problem. And then we need to start thinking about winners and losers as well. So if you are in India and China, you would be thinking about Siberia right now. If you're a long-term planner, right? Resources are changing. We have to start thinking about in those dimensions as well. and I think climate change is obviously we are vulnerable to that, but also an opportunities that we mitigate, to get the necessary capital to mitigate and adapt, so that we can protect our future generations from getting exposed to it and becoming a liability to the rest of the world, frankly speaking.
Thank you. Dr. Salman, one last question before we conclude the session, because there are a lot of other questions as well, but probably people can interact with the speakers during the dinner. This is about the energy, the impact of energy demand and supply globally, and how do you see the shift moving from fossil oil to renewable energy?
So I think the trend in renewable energy mix continues. If Trump comes in, probably it will slow down, at least from the US perspective. It can't reverse it. I think the Middle Eastern states are well aware of that, and you can see planning accordingly. They are diversifying their economies, they are changing their social structure. And what gives me hope is looking at the progress and speed of progress in the Middle East. So China transformed itself within 20 years. I worked on the BRICS report with Jim O'Neill. I was an analyst, but obviously he was the major author. So Brazil, Russia, India, China in early 2000. And we saw with our own eyes how China transformed and pulled 500 people out of poverty doing that. Not using, by the way, a pure market-based system, and neither a democracy, right? So we need to start thinking about other things. And then you have the transformation of India now in play. So I think I agree with the projections Ali was sharing earlier. It's going to be like, if we don't do anything about it and we are lagging with them, it's going to be like North Korea, South Korea type of situation, right? And you're talking about social media curbs, you will see information stifling that you have never seen before, because that's the only way to keep people happy, by not telling what's happening next door, right? That's what North Korea and South Korea do. So we have to think about, the renewable energy mix is coming through. This is going to be, I think, a big theme, still remains a big theme, and the supply chain around that. And that's another angle of this decoupling we were talking about between US and China. Critical metals, rare earth metals are also in the chain. Anything which is producing EV, hydrogen being the new technology. And I think the only advantage Pakistan has is that we are a blank canvas. So we can wait for the lowest cost technology to appear and embrace that. That's the only silver lining and positive side compared to other countries. But I think fossil fuels are here to stay. You will see spikes. Obviously the geopolitical situation is always a upside risk to fossil fuels, but I think the projections are 2035. We see the peak on global fossil fuel demand, and then obviously the mix starts to change.
Okay, thank you very much for a very insightful session. Please give a big round of applause for this panel.
Thank you, Dr. Salman, Zafar, Ali, Dr. Hasanain, Mohammad Shoaib for your insightful and candid discussion. Now we'll quickly proceed to distribution of mementos. May I request the panelists to please come in front, and may I also request our board members who are here, Abdul Rahman Tahir and Tahir Saeed, to please come on the stage. Applause to all the Dr. Saab. So the dinner is waiting. We're just waiting for all of you to come up for the picture.
Wait, sir.